never forget that day. The day the king came to my town. My town, you know, the small town, the one that always gets ignored. I was just a teenager. My family was farmers. Family farm we'd had for a long time. But when all the pageantry associated with the king coming through happened in our town, we did something that we never did. No, we never did this. We stopped what we were doing, stopped caring for the crops, and we went out to see the king. You know, the only day we ever got off was the Sabbath. But we went to see the king. It was incredible. You know, you're a teenager, and this is the most incredible thing you've ever seen. And my dad had always told me what a great king Jehoshaphat was. How incredible a ruler that he was. How he trusted God. And the king came through and told us about a legal system that he was going to put in place to help us follow God's laws. And, you know, even as a teenager, I remember thinking, this is a guy I can follow. My dad had the same idea. You know, we'd been farmers for generations. You know what he does after he sees the king in person? He is so impressed. He packs up the whole farm, packs up the family, moves us to the capital city in Jerusalem. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but my dad had some incredible business savvy, all right? He takes our farm, our family, what we'd known for generations, moves us to Jerusalem and sets up a shop there because he heard that Jehoshaphat was putting in place a system of lower courts and higher courts, and the disputes that couldn't be settled in the lower courts in the country would go to the higher courts in Jerusalem. So he knew a bunch of people were going to be coming there. And so we set up shop there, and sure enough, business boomed. The reforms that Jehoshaphat put in place brought people in who were seeking to follow God's will, and we had a great life there. Great life. And we loved our king, you know. He led us well. He pointed us towards God's law, and it was a good time for us. And then another day I'll never forget happened. I remember working in the shop. I was a little older now. I was there with my wife. We'd just gotten married, just had a baby. And a bunch of soldiers came running down the street. You know, these were the professional soldiers, the best of the best, the guys who were out on patrol, making sure the countryside was secure. And they come running down the streets, and you know when the professional soldiers look scared, something bad is going down. And sure enough, a couple hours later, word starts trickling through the people who are milling through the shop that the king has called on the entire country to join him in a fast, to pray for God's guidance and deliverance. And we're all standing there going, what in the world is going on? And so we join our king. We trust that what he's telling us to do is important. So we join him in fasting and praying and seeking God's will. And then soon after, we get word that he's going to address all of us from the city square. So we go. I bring my wife. I bring my baby. My parents are there. The whole family's there, along with many, many people from the city. And they've got their whole family there. And we stop to listen to the king. Come to find out, a huge, huge army had massed against us outside the city. And the reason why those soldiers looked so scared is because they knew just from their scouting mission that we were outmatched. We couldn't face these enemies. And so the king calls us all together, and he leads us in a prayer. Praying for God's deliverance, praying that God would see us through this trial. And we joined with our king. and we respected him for how he was leading us. An amazing thing happened. A guy, and he just happened to be standing not far from me. His name was Jahaziel. I'll never forget it. He starts speaking up, saying that God had revealed to him how he would deliver the people. Jehoshaphat listened to what he said, and this tells you something about this king. Listen to this man from the city. Hears God's voice, God's will speaking through this man, and listens. And then once he hears God's instructions, he falls on his face before God and praises him and worships him, and we do the same. Now the instructions, well, they were a little crazy. I mean, I'm not a professional soldier, but I know you don't send the choir out, marching in front of everybody to take on the marauding hordes. That's not what you do. But that's what God said. And I trusted that our king, that he was able to discern God's will. And I knew that since the army that had amassed against us was so great, they were going to come looking for reservists, for young men like myself. So I went back home. I found our sword. I say our sword, our family sword. We had one sword. It had been in the family for a long time. We'd used it on the farm to help pry out wagons that had gotten stuck. I mean, this thing was beat up and rusty. It was kind of embarrassing, really. And I didn't know how to use it. But sure enough, the knock came on my door that morning when the soldiers were going to move out. They said, "Fall in." And I fell in with my rusty sword. And we started marching out to the field of battle. The choir singing, we joined along with them. Jehoshaphat right there with us. He was singing too, moving throughout the ranks. Quite an amazing sight. And we start coming up to the point where we're going to crest the hill overlooking the valley where the scouts had said the enemy was camped. My heart was beating so hard because there was no way we could win. Do you understand that? There was no way. They had us outnumbered. They had better weapons, better armor. They were better trained. There was no way. We crest the hill and we move into our battle formation, the formation where we would charge them. And then the whispers start coming back through the ranks. The army's dead, defeated, already destroyed before we had even got there. What in the world? I'm thinking, so what happened? Did they kill themselves? Well, it turns out there had been another force who'd come in and ambushed them. And by the time we got there, they had completely wiped each other out. Jehoshaphat had been right. God did deliver us. And you know what was funny about the whole thing? Is it took us 3 days to go out there and gather up all the spoils. That's how much stuff these guys had with them. And then we came back into the city, and we praised God. We rejoiced in His deliverance. Jehoshaphat was there, leading us into the city, praising God. And it was an incredible day. One of the best days of my life. And I was so glad that I had a king like Jehoshaphat. A king who I could follow, a king who I knew would do the right thing. But, he ended up letting me down. I thought that he would always follow God's will, that he would always be on the right path. He'd done such an incredible thing, had such great faith leading us out into that battle. But I guess he forgot. I guess he forgot about God's deliverance. And at one point, he makes an alliance with a wicked king. So we're going to build a bunch of boats together, build a navy, so that we can defend our land better. He trusted that this alliance would strengthen the kingdom, and he forgot that, I don't understand, but he forgot that it was God who ultimately saved us, delivered us. And that navy ended up sinking in the ocean in a storm. And I confess my heart was broken because I put a lot of trust in this king. And I thought, surely this man would follow God's will. And even though he did for the most part, I learned that he's just a man like me. He fails too. And I learned that, I've got to have my trust in someone who's bigger than a king. The God who delivered us. It was God who delivered us. I learned that, and I came to realize that it didn't have anything to do with the knowledge of Jehoshaphat, the military strategy that was rolling around in his brain. No. It was God, not a man. That is the story of Jehoshaphat. You heard a little bit about his story a few moments ago, and that's a little bit more about his reign. So what can we learn from this story? What can we learn from Jehoshaphat's success and his failure? One of the things that struck me as I was reading this passage is that Jehoshaphat, he was a good ruler. I mean, you read towards the end in chapter 20, it said he walked in the way of his father, the way of Asa, his father, and did not turn aside from it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. So, generally, he was a good king, but he still failed. Even though he followed God's will most of the time, he still failed. So what can we learn from Jehoshaphat? What can we apply to our lives and apply to our ministry? I started thinking about some men that I admire. Like most of you, I like to listen to different preachers because I can always learn from them, learn how they preach, learn from their preaching. And so I listen to them and I respect them. Men like John Piper, Mark Driscoll. I like to read books by N.T. Wright. But what happens if one of those men fails? What happens if a man like Matt Chandler, who I greatly respect, fails? Have I tied some of my identity so much up into a man, so much into their teaching, that when they fall, it crushes me, it crushes my ministry? Have I forgotten the God who is above them, the God that they preach? So I want to encourage you this morning to not lose sight of God, because it's easy for us to get caught up in following one particular man, following one particular movement. I've read articles about people who just follow John Piper so closely that they even try to emulate his mannerisms when they preach. I mean, really, come on. What happens if you're that engrossed in a person, in their teaching, in their life, that dependent upon them for direction? What happens when they disappoint you, when they fail? And because they're men, they will disappoint us. and they will fail us. You know, another thing that comes to mind is, you all know what happens in a couple weeks, right? It's all over the news. You can't open up a paper, turn on the TV, listen to the radio without hearing about the election coming up in a couple weeks. Everybody's saying that the tide is shifting, change is coming. We heard that a couple years ago too. Change is coming, things are going to get better, right? And it seems like we go through this every couple years. A new person comes along, or the same old person changes their tune a little bit, and we put our faith in them, that they're going to go and they're going to do the right thing. And what happens? Same thing that's happened since politics has been around. They disappoint us. And I know from talking to people in the church, and I can't speak for your churches, but it seems to be prevalent among evangelicals that we put a lot of faith in our government, in certain people in our government. Like if we get this one person in office, everything's going to change. But the truth is, they're going to disappoint us, and they're going to fail, and they're going to fall. And if we're trusting in them to make things better, then we have missed it. We have missed it. Because ultimately, it's God who's in control. Ultimately, it's the saving message of Jesus Christ that's going to change lives and change our communities and change our churches, and not some preacher out there that we like to listen to on the radio, and not some politician. So brothers, remember who it's all about. Remember, it's all about God. It's all about Jesus. It's all about His message. It's not about some great pastor. It's not about some great political leader, because they will fail us. Even a man who did so much good like Jehoshaphat, who had the faith to step out and do a seemingly crazy thing, still failed. He still failed. So make sure that you've got God first, that you keep Him where He's supposed to be, and that you don't elevate men, preachers, politicians to take His place. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank You for this day, and I thank You for the story of Jehoshaphat, for the lessons that we can learn from it. Lord, I pray that You would help us as we go out into our ministries, as we continue in our studies, that we would remember to keep You in Your rightful place, that we would not let preachers or politicians or authors usurp Your rightful place. Father, I thank You for Your word and for this opportunity to teach it. It's in Jesus' name.